On this episode of Thinking Aloud, we're continuing our study of Revelation, and we're going to be covering Daniel's 70 weeks next on Thinking Aloud. Welcome back to another episode of Thinking Aloud. I'm your host, Michael Wilson. So glad that you have taken the time out of your schedule to listen on whatever streaming platform that you listen to this on. I always appreciate your comments. We love it when we get new subscribers or people liking the podcast. So would you do me a favor? If you haven't already subscribed, would you hit the subscribe button? Would you like this? Would you share it with someone else? At the end of it, leave us a comment. Let us know what you thought. Reach out to us with any questions you might have. We always love feedback here on Thinking Aloud. We're continuing our series on understanding Revelation, demystifying a mystical book. Many people do not understand Revelation. It scares a lot of people. A lot of people don't want to think about it. And in this series, we've been exploring an alternate view of Revelation. Most Christians that I know and the way that I grew up read Revelation like it was sometime in our future, that there was going to be the rapture of the church. There was going to come a 7-year tribulation period where this mysterious figure called the Antichrist was going to rise up and he was going to deceive the whole world. And then there was going to come this great battle called Armageddon, where Jesus was going to come back with all the saints and destroy all of his enemies. That's the way I was raised. That's the way a lot of people in the evangelical world look at Revelation. I have not held that viewpoint in probably over 20 years. And a lot of people have never really sat down and looked at Revelation from a historical context and asked the question, are the things described in Revelation, is there any historical context in which they've been fulfilled? And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at Revelation from a different point of view. Now, I'm not here to fight with anyone. I'm not here to tell you you're wrong. I'm not here to try to convince you of my way of looking at it. I'm simply trying to give people another way of looking at it that, in my opinion, makes more sense. So in order to do that, we're going to go all the way back to the book of Deuteronomy. And you might say, well, what does Deuteronomy have to do with the book of Revelation? We're going to see how it does have something to do with Revelation. And then we're also going to look at the book of Daniel. And we're going to look at a prophecy that Daniel was given by an angel. And we're going to look at how that plays into Revelation. So in this episode, we're not really going to be in the book of Revelation at all. We're going to go back and do some background work. So let's get right into this. So we are trying to demystify this mystical book. And so we want to look at the Abrahamic covenant. We want to go all the way back and start with Abraham, because God promises Abraham that he will make him a father of nations. And we know that Abraham becomes the father of the Israelites. And we know that Abraham is also the father of the Arabs because they are the descendants of Ishmael. We know that Abraham had two sons, Isaac, the promised child, and Ishmael, the child that was born out of Abraham's own idea to make the promises of God come to pass. And we know that through Isaac, we have Isaac has a son named Jacob, and then Jacob has 12 sons, from which we get the 12 tribes of Israel. And we know that from Genesis, the 12 sons of Jacob and Jacob himself end up in Egypt because of Joseph. And there was a famine in the land of Israel. You can read all about this in the latter chapters of Genesis. But we find out that Israel goes to Egypt, and now after a period of time, Israel becomes slaves of Pharaoh. And so they're slaves, and God one day hears their cry, sends them Moses the deliverer, and Moses leads them out. What we what we call an exodus, and they came out to freedom. And you can read all about that in the book of Exodus, and that's where we get the 10 commandments and the 10 plagues against Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And God calls them out, and they wander in the wilderness. They complain against God. They don't believe God. And so God says, okay, a generation is going to have to die off in the wilderness for a new generation to come up. And we get to Deuteronomy, and we're going to find what Moses does in Deuteronomy. But we see that at Mount Sinai, that God makes a covenant with the nation of Israel. God breaks a or makes a covenant. I'm sorry, he doesn't break a covenant. He makes a covenant with Israel, and that's where we get the 10 commandments. And Israel says that we will do what you say. Now, what's interesting is that God wanted them to be a nation of priests. He wanted them to be a kingdom of priests. But God, when they saw God on the mountaintop talking with Moses, and they saw or heard the thunder, and they saw the lightning, and they saw the darkness, they were afraid. And so one time when Moses came back down, they told Moses, said, look, we will do whatever you say that God tells us to do. You go talk to God. And so God makes a covenant with them. I personally don't think that was necessarily what the Father wanted, but he gave in to the people. And so we have the law, what we now call the law of Moses, or what some people call the Old Covenant. But in the New Testament and the Gospels, Jesus referred to it as the law of Moses, or they referred to it as the law. So now Israel has this law. Moses is about to die. At the end of Moses' life, he reiterates to the people the law. They're about to cross over into the promised land. Moses is not allowed to go because Moses disrespected God in front of the Israelites, and God said, Moses, your punishment's going to be that you don't get to go over. But Joshua is ready to lead the children over into Jericho, to face Jericho across the Jordan River. But Moses is going to die in the wilderness. And Moses reiterates the commands of God to the people. And in Deuteronomy chapter 28, 27 and 28, he goes over the promises, the good things that are going to happen if Israel obeys God. But he also covers the curses, or the things that's going to happen to Israel if they don't obey God. And it's very important for us to look at these so that we can get some hindsight into the book of Revelation. So we find that in the law of Moses that there are blessings and cursings. We read in Deuteronomy 28 verses 49 through 65 some of these specific curses. I'm not going to read all of those. I'm just going to put these scriptures up there, the verses, so that you can see them and you can read those when you get a chance. But in verse 27, Moses said that God would visit the children of Israel with the plagues of Egypt if they disobeyed God. So God takes obedience very seriously with Moses and the children of Israel. And basically he says, if you do what's right, you'll be blessed. If you don't do what's right, you're going to live under a curse. And part of that curse was that they would find themselves experiencing the very plagues that God had put upon the nation of Egypt right before the Exodus. And God is telling Moses all of these things to tell to the Israelites so that the Israelites would understand what's going to happen to them for disobedience. In verses 49 through 52, we see that God says a nation would swoop down like the eagle. Well, one of the interesting things that you can look ahead in history and know is that the Roman Empire had the eagle as their symbol. And we're going to see in Matthew 24 in a couple of episodes, or maybe the next episode or two, we're going to see where Jesus said something about the eagles. Then we see in Deuteronomy 28, verses 53 through 57, that God actually says they'll resort to cannibalism as part of the curse. Well, we're going to look in another episode how that actually happened to Israel during the siege of Jerusalem by the Roman soldiers between AD 66 and AD 70. Then in verse 64, God says, I will scatter you abroad. Now we know that that happened numerous times throughout Israel's history. Israel would do well, then they would get into a period of apostasy and they would rebel, and then God would send in other nations to discipline them. Eventually, the nation of Israel was split into two due to a civil war, and you had the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom. Both of those kingdoms ended up being carted away by other nations. And we're also going to see that after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, how many of the Jewish people were carted off into slavery. So God says, I will scatter you abroad. Then in Deuteronomy chapter 31, God tells Moses, and then Moses tells the people that they will eventually fall away. That God says, look, I'm giving them all of these blessings. I'm putting all of this out there for them, but they're going to fall away. God knew their heart ahead of time. The Israelites, for whatever reason, and we all are this way. I'm not singling out the ancient Israelites, but we all can be hard-hearted. We all can be stiff-necked. We all can be stubborn, and we want to do our own thing. Israel did this repeatedly and repeatedly paid a heavy price for all of that. But God tells Moses ahead of time, Moses, they're going to fall away. And then in chapter 32, God gives them what we call the Song of Moses. And God says, teach them this song. Now, what's interesting is back then, the majority of people were illiterate. So they would have learned through stories and also this song. So as they sang the Song of Moses, they would constantly be reminded through the generations about these blessings and these curses. It was a constant reminder of what God told them would happen if they obeyed and what would happen if they disobeyed. And then we're going to see, as I put there on the slide, that in Revelation chapter 15, verses 1 through 4, this Song of Moses is going to come up again in the book of Revelation. So we're going to see later in another episode how the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 32 plays out in Revelation. So after this, we have the rise of Joshua. Joshua carries the children of Israel over into the promised land. They cross the Jordan. They battle Jericho. Then they battle Ai, and they get defeated at Ai. And you have the story of Achan, and then they subdue the land for the most part. And then Joshua dies, and we're left with the book of Judges, which says, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So the children of Israel would disobey God. God would send in another nation. They would cry out to God. God would raise up a judge who would deliver them. And this goes on and on and on throughout the book of Judges. And then finally, Israel says, well, we want a king. We want to be like the other nations. Just give us a king. And so God gives them what they want. God didn't want them to have a king, but because they wanted that, God says, okay, I'm going to give you a king, but these are the things that's going to happen. And it wasn't a good thing. And so we find that God sets up Saul as a king, and then we have David, and then we have Solomon, and then under Solomon's son, the kingdom splits into two, and we have the northern kingdom, and we have the southern kingdom. So now we have a divided kingdom in 931 BC. Judah, which is two of the tribes, they were conquered in 597 BC by the Babylonians. But Israel, the 10 tribes, they were conquered in 731 BC by the Assyrians. And so you see that Israel did not obey God, and God did exactly what he said he was going to do. He was going to scatter them abroad. So we pick up our story with the prophet Daniel, who had been taken to Babylon. He had been captured when the Babylonians came in and took over Jerusalem and decimated the people at that time, and then carried off a bunch of slaves to Babylon. And we find when we read the book of Daniel that Daniel and his three friends actually prospered and thrived in the Babylonian government. And so Daniel is praying about his people. He's praying about Israel. Specifically, he's reminded of the prophet Jeremiah, where Jeremiah talked about them and prophesied that they were going to be in captivity for 70 years. Daniel, we're going to pick this up because Daniel is crying out in Daniel 20, and let's read it. Now, while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord, my God, in behalf of the holy mountain of my God, while I was still speaking in prayer, then the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision previously, came to me in my extreme weariness about the time of the evening offering. He gave me instruction and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you insight with understanding. At the beginning of your supplications, the command was issued, and I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed. So give heed to the message and gain understanding of the vision. Now, I've put some things in red here and yellow, and these are the things that I want to highlight throughout the rest of this episode. Daniel 9:24 through 27. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And its end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war. Desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So, the first thing I want to emphasize is growing up, I was taught that there would be 69 weeks from the time that the issue was decreed for the rebuilding of Jerusalem, which had been destroyed by the Babylonians, until the time of Christ. But then there was going to be the church age, and there was going to be a stop to after those 69 weeks. So God was going to give 69 weeks to the people of Israel, and then we were going to go through this dispensation called the church age, which basically was God putting a pause on time on these 70 weeks. Then the church was going to be raptured out, and there were going to be 7 years of tribulation, and that was going to be Daniel's 70th week. I have a real problem with that because it doesn't make sense. Why would God say 70 weeks have been decreed for your people? He says there's going to be 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and then a final week. But why would he stop that? Why would there be a gap? And we're going on, over 2,000 year gap between Messiah being killed and resurrected, then this church age, and then somewhere in our future, there's going to be one more 7 year period. To me, it makes a whole lot more sense to see if these 70 weeks actually transpired all in time and consecutive time. So there's no gap between the 69th week and the 70th week. So let's take a look and see if we can make that work. So when you look at this, he says 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city. And notice, it's to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, and to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So we see that there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah, the Prince. I'm going to show you a timeline in just a few moments of how that works out. But here's what I want us to look at. Verse 27. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. Now, many people state and believe that that's talking about the Antichrist, that during the tribulation, that an Antichrist is going to come and he's going to establish world peace. But as it says there, in the middle of the week, he's going to cut off sacrifice. In other words, he's going to break this covenant. So for the first 3.5 years, he's going to bring in world peace. The last 3.5 years, it's going to be utter chaos. But here's what I want you to think about. All right, so what would happen if millions upon millions of people suddenly excuse me, suddenly were raptured out? Millions and millions of people suddenly disappeared. I know that there's enough people with Bible knowledge to instantly realize that a rapture has taken place, if that teaching is true. So when this man arises to say, hey, I'm going to bring about world peace, he's going to have to really be influential and deceive the entire world. Now, some people believe that that's going to happen, that he's going to rise up and claim to be this great man to bring world peace, and that everybody's just going to fall over themselves to get in on what he's doing. I just don't see that happening. I just don't see millions and millions of people suddenly disappearing and the media and the governments and everybody else spinning that to make people realize, hey, that wasn't a rapture. We don't know what happened. Maybe aliens took them. Maybe they all just, whatever. We don't know what happened. That makes no sense. I mean, if we just think about that, that just doesn't make any sense how that would be pulled off. So let's take a look at this a little bit closer. So 70 weeks equals 490 years, because in this prophetic word, a week equals a year. So it's 70 sets of 7, 490 years. And there's things that are to be accomplished within these 70 weeks. Number one is to finish the transgression or the rebellion of Israel. Remember, God told Moses, he said, these people will rebel. They will fall away. So these 70 weeks have been decreed for Daniel's people, the Israelites. This is not a prophecy concerning Gentiles, because Gentiles weren't included in the covenant. This was a covenant with the nation of Israel. And the angel Gabriel said to Daniel, 70 weeks have been determined for your people to finish their rebellion, to make an end to sin. The words there in the Greek mean or the Hebrew mean to consume the offense. So 70 weeks have been determined to consume the offense. The third thing, to make atonement, which means cover for iniquity, or our perversity and our bent to sin. So part of the 70 weeks, it's going to finish the rebellion, make an end to sin, and to bring atonement for iniquity. Well, did Jesus do that on the cross? Well, I believe he did, because he became sin. He became our sin. So he put an end to sin because he became our sin and he died upon the cross. Now, am I saying that people don't still sin? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that Jesus put an end to it, and the penalty for it, he took all of that. He became our sin and paid the penalty of sin. Let's take and covers our iniquity. It also was to bring in everlasting righteousness. When we talk about Jesus and his kingdom, it's an everlasting kingdom. It is a kingdom of righteousness. And then he says it is to seal up vision and prophecy. To seal up vision and prophecy. We're going to see in a couple of episodes where Jesus is the one, the Lamb of God is the one that takes the scrolls that have seals on them, this prophetic word that's been sealed up, and he breaks the scroll. Daniel is going to be told to seal this word up. Then in Revelation, we're going to see where this prophecy, I believe it is this one, is unbroken. And we're going to see how all of this that God's talking about is going to play out. But these are the purposes of the 70 weeks. And then lastly, to anoint the most holy place. Now, the word place there could mean place, but it also could mean Messiah or the Holy of Holies. So this last week is to anoint, could mean to anoint the Messiah. For what purpose? To become the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, to become the deliverer, to become the Lord of all. So Daniel is given a prophecy of 70 weeks for his people, for all of these things to play out. Let's take this just a little bit further. The start of the 70 weeks comes from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem to Messiah the Prince. So then Daniel is told there are 7 weeks and then 62 weeks. So there's 49 years and then 62. Let's see, 70 weeks minus 49. Oh, well, I'm not even going to try to do that. I just got sidetracked there. 7 weeks and then 62 weeks. So we have 69 weeks, which comes out to 400 and 83 years. So we find that in 457 BC, Artaxerxes issues a decree to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. And we can read about that in the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is praying. He becomes sad about the state of Jerusalem and the temple. He goes before King Artaxerxes, and King Artaxerxes gives him the go ahead to go back to Jerusalem and get that temple rebuilt. So from that start, the 70 weeks has begun. Then we find, and that took 7 years, 7 weeks. That took 49 years. So then we see that from the very first decree. Then we see that Jesus' baptism, which happens around 27 AD, that's 483 years from the initial decree to rebuild Jerusalem. So we see there 69 weeks until Jesus' baptism. Well, what's so significant about Jesus' baptism? The significance is that's the start of Jesus' ministry. That's when Jesus begins his ministry to deliver the earth from sin, specifically the Jewish people, because he was sent to be their Messiah. So then we see that Jesus is crucified in around 30 AD, which is in the middle of the week, 3.5 years. Now, Jesus puts an end to sacrifice through his death on the cross. So if we go back to Daniel 9, he says that there is going to come one that puts an end to sacrifice. Now, if you are raised with the idea of an antichrist and the 70th week being off in the future somewhere, then you believe that the antichrist is going to put an end to sacrifice. You also have to believe that a third temple is going to be established in Jerusalem, that they're going to sacrifice animals again. And I would just say to you, how is that going to go over worldwide? Can you imagine the Israelites putting together a temple and sacrificing animals? They will have people coming against them left and right for the cruelty of animals. It's just going to happen in our day and time. But they have to build a third temple. They have to get everything just right. And then they start animal sacrifices again. And the church is raptured out at some point, according to this teaching, and this antichrist is going to either help them get this done or is going to be okay with it, but then in the middle of this 7-year period he's going to put an end to it. That's how you have to read it if you have a futuristic view of Revelation and the end of time. But what if Jesus' death on the cross is what Daniel was prophesying about, that he will put an end to sacrifice in the middle of the week. Now, we know that the Judaic system went on after Jesus' death on the cross for another 40 years until the temple was destroyed in AD 70. That's a historical fact. So now, in my opinion, we have this gap period between the old covenant and the new covenant. We have this 40-year gap period, which we're going to look at when we get into Matthew 23 and 24, because Jesus says, upon this generation, all these things will happen, and this generation will not pass away until all this is fulfilled. So, a generation in biblical terms is 40 years. So, from 30 AD to 70 AD, that's 40 years. But Jesus' death on the cross began the new covenant where there was no more need for sacrifice. If you read Paul's epistles, especially if you read the book of Hebrews, you're going to see that Jesus was the final sacrifice. Now, the Jewish people, those that did not follow Jesus, they continued to sacrifice, continued following the law of Moses until AD 70. But Jesus on the cross put an end to that. And then in Daniel, it also says there is going to come the son of a prince that's going to bring desolation. Again, if you're looking at it futuristically, then you're looking at a person that we would call the Antichrist doing that. But what if the desolation is the Roman army that's going to besiege Jerusalem? We're going to see in Luke 21 where Jesus says this is the desolation, the abomination of desolation. When you see the armies, the enemy armies surrounding the city. When did that happen? From AD 66 to AD 70. That is the desolation. Now, again, maybe you've heard this and you agree with it. Maybe you've heard this and you don't agree with it and you're still looking for an antichrist coming. That's fine. Maybe you've never heard this. If you've never heard it, I would challenge you to really look at this and see if the things that Daniel prophesied in Daniel chapter 9 that we've just looked at can be fulfilled within that 70 weeks. Can all of these things be fulfilled within those 490 years? Now, let me throw out one other little caveat to you. Peter came to Jesus one time, was talking to him, and he said, Lord, how often do I have to forgive my brother? Up to 7 times? And you know the story if you know your Bibles. Jesus said, no, I tell you, you need to forgive 70 times 7. Well, what is 70 times 7? 490. Would it make sense that Jesus said that because Daniel had been given a prophecy of 490 years, 70 times 7, 70 sets of 7, that God was extending grace and mercy to the nation of Israel to get it right? And the most profound way that he extended grace and mercy to them was that he sent his son as a final plea for Israel to give their hearts 100% completely to him. What did they do with his son? Well, they crucified him. And there's parables that Jesus gives that we'll look at later, where Jesus gives these parables about these things. And the Pharisees get mad because they know that Jesus is talking about them. And when we look next in the next episode at Matthew 23, we're going to see how a lot of this has played out and at the end of this 490-year period. Let's take a look just a little bit more. So the one who makes desolation, I believe, is the Roman people and the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. So let's take a look at this chart, and I want to give credit to John Noe. This chart is from the book Unraveling the End. So you can see there on the left-hand side that Artaxerxes' decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem happened in 457 BC. And it took 49 years from that decree for Jerusalem to be restored and rebuilt in 408 BC. Then we have the birth of Christ around 4 BC. And Jesus's baptism, he's anointed and baptized and begins his public ministry at AD 27. So there on this chart, you can see the 7 weeks, then the 62 weeks, which comes up to 483 years or 69 weeks. Now this right here is where our differences lie, or my differences lie with people that believe in a rapture and a 7-year tribulation. What do you do with that final week? According to them, and the way I was raised and what I believed as a young person, that at the death and resurrection of Jesus, that starts the church age, and God pushes pause, and that we're still waiting for that last 7 years. I don't believe that, and we can look at this chart and I'll explain why. Let's go on. So you see there in AD 27, Jesus begins his ministry. Well, Jesus ministered for 3.5 weeks, and then he's cut off. The Messiah is cut off 3.5 weeks. Look again at Daniel chapter 9. The Messiah is cut off. Well, how's he cut off? He is killed, he's crucified, and his death and resurrection put an end to the sacrifice. But notice that in 3.5 years after Jesus is crucified and resurrected, that we now have Philip ministers in Samaria. We have the death of Stephen. And then you have Saul that was there at the death of Stephen, but Philip is ministering to the Samaritans, which was outside of the Jewish people. And then you see Stephen martyred, and Saul is there. Well, Saul eventually is going to get saved and become Paul, and the gospel is going to be taken to the Gentiles. Now, when we get into Matthew 24, we're going to see where Jesus talks about that concerning the angels going to the four corners of the earth. We're going to see how that plays out. But right now, I just want you to understand that there is a way to look at this historically and say that the 70th week was fulfilled 3.5 years after Jesus's death, that was the full 490 years, that when the gospel was when the gospel was taken to the Gentiles. Remember, Jesus said to the Israelites that this is going to be taken from you and given to a nation that will produce fruit. Well, who was that? That was the Gentiles, because in the Jewish mind, there were only two groups of people, the Israelites and the Gentiles. So Jesus said there in Matthew 24 that all of this will come upon this generation. And then if you look down there towards the bottom, you'll see that the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Now, growing up, I was taught that the gospel had to go to every nation in the world, in the civilized, every nation on planet Earth before Jesus could come back. But if you'll look there in Colossians 1, 6, and 23, in the book of Romans, the book of Acts, the gospel, according to Paul, had already been preached to the whole world. We're going to look at that when we look at Matthew 24, which is going to be in a couple of weeks. But we're going to look at that, how the Bible, the New Testament, actually tells us that the gospel was preached to the whole world. Now, where we get mixed up is because we're reading it from a 21st century mindset. And when we think whole world, we're thinking every single country that exists right now. That's not what they were talking about. They were talking about the known civilized world, which was the Roman Empire. So the gospel had been preached throughout the Roman Empire before AD 70, thus fulfilling that prophecy. So we find that from AD 66 until AD 70, that we have the Roman-Jewish War, and we have a great tribulation, and we're going to look at all of that. We're going to look at Daniel's time of the end. We're going to see all that, because we're going to look at how the Roman siege of Jerusalem was considered the great tribulation. that in my way that I understand this, and there's other people that understand this the same way. Harold Eberly, a great teacher on this. Victorious Eschatology is his book. I've listened to him for years. I encourage you to read his stuff. Gary DeMar talks about this. John Noe. Lynn Hiles has incredible teaching out there on this stuff. If you want to do a really, really good deep dive into this, and if you don't know who to listen to, if you'll get in contact with me, I can point you to some resources that will explain this a whole lot further. But it is amazing how, when you look at the historical context of what's already happened, how all of this actually fits into Israel's history. So, in other words, our last days have already happened. That the last days are actually past days. That the last days that the New Testament talks about is not the end of the world, but it's the end of the Mosaic law. It is the end of the what we would call the Old Covenant. They would have called it the Mosaic Covenant. But it is the end of that age, and now we live in the new age of the new covenant. We live in the age of the new covenant, and we've been living in the last days, so to speak, of this new covenant since Jesus died on the cross. But the first century Christians and the first century Jewish people, they were living in the last days of the Mosaic covenant, and that covenant came to an end in AD 70, completely demolished in AD 70. According to God's plan. Now, are there people that still follow that? Absolutely. Is it still valuable in God's eyes? I don't believe it is, because Jesus established a new covenant, and it was a covenant established between him and the Father, and you and I get to participate in that covenant. So I hope that I've given you some things to think about. I hope that maybe if this is the first time you're hearing it, that you'll take a look at it a little bit deeper. If you've got questions or comments, I would love to have a dialogue with you. I would love to converse with you. I'm not going to try to change your mind. I'm not going to fight with you or argue with you over it. I'm just going to give you some things to think about, some things to look at. So until next time, I appreciate you watching this, listening to this on whatever streaming platform. If you've liked what you've heard, please like this, share this, subscribe, help me get the word out there. Next week, we are going to take a look at Matthew 23, and we're going to look at the woes that Jesus gives the Pharisees, and we're going to see how that plays off of Daniel 9. It's going to be really good, and I hope that you'll tune in to watch, or watch it later at your convenience. Until next time, I just want to end, as I always do, with this. You were created by love, out of love, to love, and to be loved. So I hope that you will learn to love well. Until next time, God bless.